Feminist Librarianship is out now. Order your copy at facetpublishing.co.uk. This podcast episode accompanies the chapter Notes from a New Professional 2, Interviews on Imposter Syndrome, written by me, Leah Higgins, Digital Officer at CILIP Scotland. I wanted to start this episode with a note that I wrote to myself in March of 2025, well before I'd written the chapter. It says, trusting yourself is a feminist act. I came to this motto through the realisation that with all of the elements that seemingly conspire against women, trusting ourselves, our judgment and our feelings can shelter us from a lot of the negativity and protect our relationship with ourselves. Imposter syndrome relies on us not trusting in ourselves, and sometimes others too. But what happens when we do? Often women are taught that anything in excess is wrong. Too much emotion is bad, too much empathy is pathetic, or too much anger is just the hormones talking. But for some reason, feeling a strong sense of imposter syndrome is justified. We should be kept in our place. I came across a quote from actress and singer Dove Cameron, who says that she always felt that she was too much for others, as if her taking up space in the room created less for others. But instead she decided to embrace her muchness. And it's something that I try and consider when those feelings are around. In listening to a podcast episode called A Side Effect of Becoming by podcast duo Plainview, I started to understand the fact that imposter syndrome will likely show up in the things we care about the most. But I considered that the energy and emotion behind these feelings can inform more than just our insecurities. Through the patriarchy's influence, we're accustomed to one notion of emotional regulation, which is to scale back and downplay our responses, either physical, mental, or emotional. But this chapter and my interviewees explore the fact that there is much more to this experience, and only in modelling other ways of regulation can we start to see the wood for the trees. I'm recording this in October of 2025. The book is currently in the first proofing stage with the publishers, and the intense waves of imposter syndrome have made me feel almost seasick at times. Bringing in others was twofold. I could share the emotional load of this huge and deep topic with others, but I could also show that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So many people experience imposter syndrome differently, and that has to remain central to our approach of dismantling it. Back full circle to what I started this episode preamble with, which is trust. I've had to trust myself a lot in this process. Trust that I'd get it right, that I'd do my topic and my contributors and my editor and publisher justice. But despite the voice in my head chirping away, trusting myself and my judgment that my experiences and choices are valid, I've been able to create this discourse that I'm very proud of, and that I'm excited for readers and listeners to engage with. So please enjoy the episode. My earlier historical chapter was a look into the past, examining how the history of women in librarianship came to be. Bookending these observations, this chapter is intended as a gesture towards examining one of the conditions of modern librarianship and contemporary womanhood, imposter syndrome. Modern problems require modern solutions, which in this case is the contemporary craft of the podcast. Accompanied by an episode, which you're listening to now, of the popular CILIP's podcast, this chapter quite literally captures voices and soundscapes to amplify the real voices of women in the sector. The conversations I conducted for this chapter with incredibly inspiring and dedicated women in the profession reached some very vulnerable and yet also special places. Each of their perspectives and journey is unique, and they speak to how they view the notion of imposter syndrome. Their conversations managed to synthesise larger topics at play for women working in our sector in 2025. All 5 contributors are at different stages in their lives and careers, yet they approached this invitation with an openness and willingness to share their thoughts. Recognising the part their voice could play in making the sector a more hospitable place for women and our stories. I didn't really know what this chapter was going to be about when I was asked to write it, not for lack of ideas, but more so conflicted by a voice in my head telling me that whatever I'd contribute wasn't good enough. This mental barrier appeared before I'd even put pen to paper, It became clear to me after speaking to so many of this book's contributors that the voice feeding me those insecurities was what I needed to write about. When asked to contribute, some of the authors had a similar reaction to mine. With others, I watched in awe at their self-assuredness. I wondered why some of us had the "are you sure I'm the best person to write this" reaction, and others didn't flinch. What was the difference between those who took the prompt and immediately felt excited for the challenge? And why did the latter come as a surprise to me? Neither reaction is right or wrong, but I felt like I needed to explore it further. What circumstances or systems are at play in these reactions? As I explored in my first chapter for this book, the feminist pedagogy I wish to utilise maintains that each individual experience is valid and unique, including my own, and we are each shaped by oscillating circumstances. I became very conscious of the words I chose because, much like my earlier chapter pointed out, women are often told how we feel, especially women in the library and information sector whose existence and experiences have been projected onto them. I didn't want to reinforce that narrative arc, but instead created space for women to share what they had authentically experienced or felt. Which is precisely why I didn't ask my interviewees, why do women in the library and information sector feel imposter syndrome? With little expectations on how these interviews might go, it soon became clear to me that everyone I spoke to had a different concept of what imposter syndrome was, how it manifests, what it can impact, and how we might dismantle it, or if it needs to be dismantled at all. The last thing I wanted to do was make the contributors feel as though I wanted to hear a certain answer, possibly skewing their true feelings. I posed to them the same prompt for consideration, which was, what are your thoughts, feelings and experiences with imposter syndrome within the library and information sector? Please feel free to give as much or as little information as you'd like, and you're welcome to share any stories that may be relevant. This is a feminist text where the personal is professional, and capturing women's voices and experiences is a central part of its purpose. The chapter that follows blends our words, taken from transcripts of the interviews alongside my own post-interview annotations. Here's what they had to say. No is a full sentence. It's not surprising that imposter syndrome is unproductive. I'm hoping by the end of this chapter that will be quite clear to readers or listeners. However, I never fully appreciated before now how much brain space these quiet niggles and second guessing consume. In a very meta sense, we could use the example of writing this book. I myself put off starting as early as I could because I was scared that I wouldn't like what I wrote. That experience also resonated for another chapter author, Jill Ryan.
Interesting, because when Kirsten emailed me initially and I went, the immediate thought was, oh, but, am I the right person to do that? And I very quickly went, you know what? Yes, Kirsten wouldn't be asking. She knows my project pretty well. She knows me pretty well at this stage. She wouldn't be asking if she didn't think I was qualified for this. And as soon as I switched my thinking, I started thinking about the chapter and it was almost writing itself in my head. And I thought, actually, I think I'm very well placed to write this chapter. I think it's timely and I'm really looking forward to it. And I haven't had a negative feeling about it since. I felt those old kind of nagging things coming in on the initial email. But as soon as I spoke to Kirsten, I didn't feel that way at all. And it's been lovely, actually. There's so much flow because I'm not second guessing myself all the time. Mm-hmm. I may be doubting at this stage whether I'm going to get it all written by the end of April.
Me too. We're all in that boat.
But I'm not doubting that I'm capable of writing it, I've done my research, I've done my interviews, I have insights of my own from the project.
Jennifer Finlay, Head of Library and Archive Services at the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, similarly shared the mental drain of communicating as a woman in the workplace. And through our conversation, I started to understand just how much of this might be occupying our brains at any given time.
This is a female sector. If I kick up a fuss, then if a man was saying that, that was him being confident and stating what the service needs. A woman is petulant, whining, or being difficult, because that's the catch-all for women. She's being difficult. It's the additional mental drain of, how do I phrase this in a way that doesn't alienate people for me making a statement that a man could make, but I'm not allowed to make without first starting off by saying I'm so sorry, and then apologising again, and then saying I hope that's not a problem, and being self-effacing. So the whole structure is built to make you try and kind of to make you feel unconfident and to put yourself forward as not confident, because if you ask for things, it's too much. But if you're saying, please, can I, then that's okay. A few years ago, I saw that thing going around about communicating as a woman and just communicating. So I try and do more of the just communicating now.
When Phillips did an Imposter Syndrome webinar a few years ago, Joe Wally, who is running it, said do one task that makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. You should do it differently than what your imposter is telling you. And for me, it was writing an email, because when I write an email, I read it over approximately 15,000 times. That process takes up quite a lot of my time, as I'm sure you can imagine, to make sure that when I communicate with someone over email, it isn't misconstrued. I'm coming across as friendly, I'm coming across as nice if I'm asking them to do something, but these are all things that even in terms of a really simple admin, like communication work, we have to consider. I've never spoken to a man that has had to think about the way he communicates in his work life at that minute level. Jennifer then showed me an example of a request she'd written from a service user asking for a particular piece of information. Within one email, Jenny had swiftly and concisely informed the patron that he'd been directed to the wrong place, and she was able to copy in the right people who would reply shortly. In our conversation, she explained that previously it would have taken her a long time to format an email of that sort, gauging the tone correctly while still being pleasant. Regardless of the quick and formal tone of Jenny's email, the patron was grateful and left the exchange with what he needed. I wonder how much of that is about librarians specifically, because you're dealing with people's requests on a daily basis. So whether it's coming from a judge or whether it's coming from a member of the public, you are on the receiving end of that request and you feel the responsibility for it when it comes into your inbox. I think that's the contention between being responsible for someone's service request and how you deal with that responsibility as a woman. That's potentially where the library and information sector has some ways to go in terms of really making women feel like it's okay to function like that. It's okay to be direct. It's okay just to communicate and say you're in the wrong place. I've done what I can for you because that's good enough.
And a lot of it sometimes as well is like we're conditioned as women that we should be supportive and helpful and make people happy. And then we go into a profession where we're dealing with people's questions and we want to make them happy. And the worst thing to draft is something saying, no, can't help you, or this doesn't exist. And I've got the responsibility for research access requests. So if you want to undertake research on the judiciary, the court staff, or court records, that will now come through that inbox that I just was showing you. And I will then have to make a recommendation to the Lord President based on the material they send about whether that research can take place or not. I had the whole team double check my no, and it was absolutely a no immediately. Should never have got to that stage.
Right.
We redrafted it multiple times because I was like, I really want to say sorry. And it just had to kind of get to the point of going, no, it is fine. It is a factual thing.
I think here it's important to note that we're not saying communicate like a man, but rather in order to do our jobs effectively, we have to learn as women that sometimes no is the appropriate answer. Also, we don't have to take on the burden or guilt of that decision. It is simply good enough to communicate with purpose and not second guess our authority when the answer is clear, although there is of course nuance to this. Sarah Louise MacDonald, an academic support librarian at the University of Edinburgh Law School, who also delivered Imposter Syndrome online training for SILIPS members, makes an interesting point about this, which I think reflects the depth of responsibility and care women take when working.
It's important that we keep realistic expectations on what the job is, I think. And I think that's part of feminism as well, is not overachieving. And it's so hard because I'm a millennial who was definitely raised as a people pleaser and an overachiever, and a pleasure to have in class and all these things. But that was what leads to burnout.
Yeah.
And that is a real problem. And burnout and imposter syndrome are so closely linked.
Yeah.
And I think it's important we recognise that. There's a design flaw that allows this to continue with lots of different people. It is in lots of people's favour if I don't set boundaries. Mm-hmm. It's in, other people benefit if I work beyond my hours. It means they don't need to pay someone else to do that work. If I work 21 hours a week, but I keep going over and above and doing the work of someone that does an extra 2 days of work, then they won't employ someone to do those extra 2 days of work. Yeah. So I'm doing someone out a job, and that's not solidarity. That's not good for the profession. That's creating a single point of failure. So I'm actually, making more problems by doing that. So I think it's really important that we do love our jobs. I really hope people do. But part of recognising that we are part of something bigger is important, and thinking about the person that comes next. And I hope the person whose job I take is thinking of me in the same way that I'm thinking of the next person that takes my job.
This concept of creating healthy boundaries so that the legacy of overworking or being overly flexible doesn't become an expectation placed on the next generation can actually become a feminist act, leaving the job's conditions just as we found them based on the boundaries we set, or perhaps leaving it better off for the next person. For example, rather than working beyond your hours, could you encourage your workplace to adopt flexible working policies which might benefit future employees? Man, I feel like a woman. Why we feel like we have to act like a man. As National Librarian and author of Feminist Librarianship's Forward, Amina Shah told me.
At the start of my career, people didn't really talk about imposter syndrome, but it was definitely something that people felt. And it might seem strange to people now that I'm doing the job I'm doing, but I definitely felt like that when I started working in libraries. And you see it, as we know, there's a lot of women who've worked in libraries, but there were very few of them in senior leadership positions. And when they often took on a particular demeanour, which was often like a kind of alpha male kind of approach, or implementers of the patriarchy, I guess. They would often uphold a lot of those things. All of these people were victims of the way that they had been schooled in what was the right thing to do. So other people have told me that, back in the day, women were really hard as nails, those women that were in charge, because they were told that's what you could be in this room and be a woman, as one woman had told me, but you were told you had to act like a man. Don't cry or be emotional or bring emotion into it or bring feeling into anything or any of that stuff. So you have to almost act not like yourself or like your instincts to be a part of the room. And so if that's what it's like for women, what it's like if you're from a different culture altogether, or neurodiversity or sexuality or any of those things, any of the things that we're kind of aware of now and we see as a powerful thing for diversity and inclusion, it was definitely seen as something to work around at the time, which is really, really sad.
Amina shared an anecdote about a woman who faced accent bias because, although hugely qualified for the job, she had a strong local dialect, which the panel felt could be a communication hindrance.
But yeah, the accent thing is really interesting, especially when what we want for libraries is to reflect communities that they serve. So it's really bizarre.
Sarah Louise referenced various stats and articles about the proportion of women said to be experiencing imposter syndrome, but something wasn't adding up.
We are predominantly women in this industry. Like a huge proportion of us are women, and in fact white women. And imposter syndrome is something that seems to more proportionately affect women in the workforce, right? So I was looking it all up and I was going, when did it all start? It's an article in 1978. It's a report, Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women, first named uniquely for women. But the stat that you always come up against when you look at imposter syndrome is 70% of women feel this way. And I sort of dug into that, and I was looking at it and I was going, why is it 70%? And where did that come from? And I couldn't nail down like one report that said 70%, but I found like 4 or 5 different ones. There's not like one amazing piece of research, but there's lots of suggestions from articles from recruitment companies or industry-specific professional bodies. They've maybe done their own research. There's an article from 2023, which was like, it's published in The Independent, but it's a piece of research done by Galaxy Chocolate, along with the Young Women's Trust. And they polled like 4,000 women or something like that. And they say 72% of women have felt this way, right? And I'm going, that's an incredibly high proportion of women.
Yeah.
And us being a women-focused industry or, you know, women-leading industry, how can the proportion of people be a majority in the majority demographic? How can that be? How can we all feel like that? That's ridiculous. So it felt odd to me. So I'm going, okay, well, it's not an individual issue then. It's a systemic issue. And there is lots of research about this. And there's a few good articles that have come up, particularly in the last few years. But there was these terms that I kept thinking about. And it's things like, someone's written a book on good girl deprogramming, eldest daughter syndrome, people pleasing, like all these things are sort of enmeshed with imposter syndrome. It's all the idea that we are giving and we are nurturing and we are caring and we always go over and above. We always put ourselves last. We always put other people forward. But it's no accident that we all feel like that. We all feel like we should be the ones in the back foot, that other people should be in a better position, or we don't deserve the things that we have earned because it's not luck that got us here, you know. And so it's a systemic issue. And there's a term of systemic inequity, which comes up in various pieces of research. And that is a much better way to look at it, in my opinion, rather than just saying we individually are the problem. The competency checking of, am I good enough? Did I deserve this? Have I done the right things? Do I belong here? Am I professional enough? It's all part of keeping us in our place. And I'm not saying it's like 1 or 2 evil men, because my feminism is not like that. It's not man-hating, but it is looking more broadly at systemic issues, and bigotry is one of them, sexism is one of them, racism is one of them, transphobia is one of them. It's all designed to keep people in a very useful little box, to stop people from feeling that they are at ease in the high-achieving place they are.
What's wrong? Inspired by my interviewees' insights so far, I wondered if there were specific parts of the job of a librarian that may have to be acknowledged as part of the systemic problem. Not parts that are inherently bad, but subtleties that may make us more susceptible to feelings of imposter syndrome. For Chaley, a Students and New Professionals Community Committee member and 2024 CILIP student medalist.
Being in libraries and information, part of like the crux of that job, or like the job is like kind of like being a know-it-all, like knowing everything. And so not only are you like, I'm not really sure, it's like, well, you have to be sure. Your job is to know things. I think that just adds an extra layer, extra level of fear, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I would imagine like it would just kind of lend itself extra to like imposter syndrome. I think especially, I feel like when you read studies, you would know more than I would, but like in my experience, when people talk about imposter syndrome, it's always like through the lens of being a woman. And I also know like we are an extremely like women dominated fields. And so I feel like there's just so many layers of like everyone feeling imposter syndrome.
Ironically, if you don't feel imposter syndrome, is it a sign that you're not professional enough or not as much of a woman?
The consensus is everyone feels it. So therefore, because we are conditioned to be self-effacing and polite and neutral and nice professionally, me saying I don't feel it is outrageous in some ways, because I'm a woman, I should feel this. I am therefore not female or feminine enough, or I'm not professional in my sector enough because I should be doubting myself.
Far from a win-win for women, this feels to me like a lose-lose. nor is time always a healer.
I think when you're a new person in a profession or in any sort of new setting like that, it's actually not a barrier, but it's actually a bit of like a kind of safe fall in terms of, oh, I'm new. Like you kind of have that little bit of protection almost, because you have that ability to go, oh, I haven't picked that up yet, or I don't know about that yet. So do you feel that, when you think about your career in maybe about 5-10 years time, whether you're going to be still at this software company or whether you're going to be somewhere else, or even within the sector or not, do you feel like the potential that imposter syndrome might creep up more?
I do think I could see developing it in like future jobs I have. Like, for example, I think at some point, we'll see if this happens, but at some point I would like to be a school librarian, I think. And I think imposter syndrome would definitely play a larger role because from my understanding, like when you're going in, you might come in as an assistant librarian, but for certain schools, like for example, international schools, which is what I think I would want to go into, you just come in like as the librarian. So you're like the end all be all. And I don't have, I think in this universe where that is something I do, I don't really know if I would have much experience between like now and then of actually being a librarian in a school setting. I think it would be kind of a hop from like this current role to that. And so I think having that kind of unfamiliarity and, for lack of a better phrase, like being kind of out of practice with what it looks like to be a librarian in a more traditional sense, I think imposter syndrome would absolutely pop up. Yeah, I think I would definitely question, like, am I actually qualified to do this? Do I even remember how to do it? Like, sure, it's like riding a bike, but if you haven't ridden a bike in 20 years, you're still going to like wobble a bit at first, I guess.
Potentially something that's a bit unique to the library and information sector, although it is quite a wide sector, something that's, we always talk about it being quite a niche one at the same time. And I think what you're talking about from going from being like a kind of information scientist to then going and potentially being a school librarian, and you're right, because of a lot of the cuts and closures and the way that school libraries function, especially with international schools as well, it very much is you are the kind of be all and end all. The buck stops with you in terms of overseeing that library service for that school. And I wonder if there is a little bit about the sector, because it is so niche, but even within that, there's so many different ways to take your progression and to take your career. I wonder how much that plays a part in people feeling imposter syndrome, because I think the way that the sector is almost kind of fragmented sometimes, and like, school librarians are here, information scientists are here, we have, further education librarians, etc., specialist libraries. I wonder if part of the way that the sector actually is kind of formatted, if that plays a part in people feeling like, oh, that's not my expertise, or I haven't done that in a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it has to. Like, I mean, I don't think I could never say never, but like being a cataloger, even like we had one unit on that once, and it's so hyper specific. And unless you're like constantly like, I guess, re-educating yourself and like reading books and practicing, like you're just gonna kind of fall behind, especially with like industry standards and whatnot.
Sarah Louise also commented on the jump from new to middle career professional and how this transition can feed into a lack of confidence.
First job out of uni I had, it wasn't the dream job for me, but it was an information related role. It was good for what it was. Where I really wanted to be was schools, and a stepping stone on the way to schools was working in a college library. Schools wouldn't have me, I didn't have experience at that point, and I did so many schools interviews, and that really knocks your confidence. Like, self-doubt's a real thing at that point when you go to umpteen interviews, and they simply won't let you have a foot in the door. And I think because of the way our industry is, there's so many jobs that you will only get the job if you've already done the job. So that's a real knock to people's confidence, and they may have transferable skills, but it's really hard to keep shoring yourself up and thinking, I can do this, when you keep being told you haven't done it, so you can't do it. Yeah. So I think that's one issue.
Why aren't we flipping tables yet? Almost all of my interviewees shared what they thought women would want to hear if they felt this sense of imposter syndrome.
I think generally everyone feels like they don't really know what they're doing and that they're not doing very much, or it's not very special. Like my team are continually trying to find time to do chartership, never quite get around to it. But every now and again, they'll say about something I've done, I'm like, right, did I tell you to do that? No. Did you identify that as an opportunity? Yes. Did you plan this yourself? Yes. Did you get the success? Did you make everything? Did you make it happen? Yes. This is an achievement. And they're like, oh. It feels like we continually need someone else to be a grown-up for us and say, you did that well. Unless somebody else says you're achieving things, most of us don't think we're achieving things, and therefore we're never going to feel like we are fitting in or doing the job well, because we all need an adult to say you're doing the job well, no matter who it is. I think everyone needs someone more senior than them, whoever that is, to say you're okay, you're doing the job well. And when you don't get that is when I think maybe the imposter syndrome is more likely to be a thing, not necessarily as imposter syndrome, but lack of confidence and lack of belief in yourself. Because if nobody's saying you are achieving things, you can't look at yourself and saying I'm achieving things unless you've got a really strong personality, and that's, you're always going to be able to drive yourself on without any feedback. And I don't think I want to know those people, they scare me.
It's understanding that everyone's in a different place with it, but also everyone's capacity is different as well. I suppose it goes back to that acknowledgement of maybe I am in a place right now where I can start to examine these things, or I just have to stick to doing my job right now and that's good enough. I think that can change and you can be reflective about that in different places. What's really come across in all of the interviews as well in different ways is that sense of having a little bit of affirmation from someone outside of your own brain, from outside the same brain that's feeding you the imposter syndrome. Jill felt that education played a really important role in understanding her own feelings of imposter syndrome, especially as someone who comes from a working class background.
I think I was 36 when I graduated, and it felt huge, and that degree has been so powerful for me. It literally changed my life and changed the jobs that I could apply for. But the reality was that working in an organisation, and we were talking about institutions earlier on, every institution by its nature is hierarchical, of course it is. And I began to feel that absolutely I was an imposter in this space. And I thought, well, if I get my master's, then I won't feel like an imposter anymore. And so I decided to do a master's in online education. And I thought, well, then I won't feel an imposter because I will have a qualification in this specific type of education that I work in, And a master's is worth so much more than a first degree. And so I did. I slogged. I worked and I studied, and I had 2 kids, and I was doing it all. I was absolutely exhausted. And at the end, I graduated into the pandemic, so I didn't even have a graduation ceremony. It was all done online, and it didn't affect my imposter syndrome at all.
Wow.
I still didn't feel I belonged in that space. And then I realised that all the people who were in kind of senior management positions, none of them had a master's in online education.
It interests me that multiple voices have captured this element of trying to outwit the feeling of imposter syndrome with little success. Is what we call imposter syndrome yet another projective oppression, something women are made to feel rather than something which can be defeated or earned? As I suggested in my first chapter, what we truly need to do is create and maintain a feminist overhaul of the system, looking at the system's language and attitudes that foster these feelings for women. We are enough, proven by the fact that nothing outside ourselves has ever worked to defeat these feelings.
The way we interact with each other, I think, is key. Which sort of brings me back to the community, solidarity and all that we were talking about earlier. Even the imposter syndrome webinar that we did, I think what people got out of that, and one of my chartership mentees attended that and said afterwards that it was so valuable. But what did we do during that session? Mostly we just talked about our experiences, and we just said this is a thing we all encounter and it's okay to feel like this. What I would have liked to do is take it that step further and say, we all feel like this. So what's the real problem here? I don't think it's us. What can we do about that? Work together to build something better.
Again, it comes back to that notion of trusting yourself and why that is a feminist act. Unknown caller, it's your imposter speaking. Speaking to my sector colleagues throughout these interviews, I noticed that they all likened the experience of imposter syndrome and the knowledge of it being like a scam, something that doesn't really exist but that has been created to evoke an atmosphere of pressure, delusion and restriction.
Self-doubt allows imposter syndrome to be something that focuses on fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work.
Wow.
And I think that's a really good kind of way to look at it, reframing it of
Absolutely.
If we think the problem is with us individually, then we don't look outwards.
In another example, Jennifer began her interview with rightfully lamenting the medicalising of women's normal feelings due to the word syndrome being attached to this experience. Okay.
So it's during COVID. And it's quite interesting because it's kind of medicalising women's normal feelings of maybe not knowing everything that they need to know to be fully competent, and turning it into, even the word syndrome is medical.
I realised that it's kind of it's like a trap. If you can keep going and going and going and pushing yourself to achieve and to spread yourself really, really thin to achieve this impossible level, and that even when you get there, it's not necessarily good enough, or you will not necessarily feel good enough. So I think that's my lesson that I've taken away from higher education. But I think it's probably the same for people from working class backgrounds, or like me, an adult returner who didn't come through a conventional route of higher education. I think those feelings of being an imposter in the space can persist for a long time. And even if you cover yourself with education, they don't necessarily go away. And I think it took me, like, a lot of things happened. I turned 50, I left my job in the same year. And I think that's what took me getting over my imposter syndrome. But it shouldn't take half a century to achieve that.
And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be something that we can do like very, there's a reason these things are in place. The barriers are put there for a reason, because it's very convenient that we are where we are and we're all overworkers and we're all people pleasers. Yeah. So people benefit from that. Mm-hmm. And also they benefit from the cosy little library trope. So it's people like us exactly where we are, but if we want to keep doing the job that we're doing, especially in this era of AI, misinformation, disinformation, this world where technology is sort of snapping at our heels, and library jobs are getting fewer and farther between, and places are dropping their libraries because we can just pay an AI bot for that. We can just do this. We can just do the other. I think it's more important than ever that we do stand together and we do recognise that we all have value, and it's just a case of recognising that and bringing everyone along with us, and making space for those that don't already have the leg up. It's very important that we do see, yes, that we individually might feel bad about a situation, but let's not just be sad about it. Let's be angry about it.
Yeah.
And I just think there's always more work to do. And the benefit of doing it together as well is when one of us has a time where we need to take a step back, or we need to focus on what's going on personally or professionally, or just keep our head down for a while, someone else can step up. And it's about having each other's backs. And that doesn't happen. You can't do that as an individual. You have to do that as a collective.
You talked about, needing that external validation, and I think for me, going for a higher degree was, I will get this external validation if I have the degree. The degree will be literally the piece of paper that says, yes, I am qualified, I should be here. But in the time that I was seeking that external validation, I think I was actually pretty good at my job. you know? There was no part of me that thought that I needed it in order to be better at my job. It was for that external validation. Particularly women need to do that work on themselves to figure out, well, why do I need external validation? You know, why can't that come from inside? And I think that speaks to, you know, some of the ways that girls are brought up, that they aren't given that internal validation that they kind of need to see them through. But also, why should we? You know, why should we seek it? It's the idea that we need to do the work on ourselves. Yes, that there is an aspect of that. But also, why are we made to feel like imposters in those spaces that we're fully qualified to be in? You know, that it's not just about us. It's not just about women being brought up without that internal self-esteem. I think there's also why don't spaces make more of an effort to be more welcoming to working class people who've come through on an unconventional route through higher education. Women with kids, why aren't workplaces more welcoming to women with kids? Why doesn't work shape around all the other things people have in their lives? Why do people's lives have to shape around work?
It feels that a lot of this can be summarised by the understanding that women in the workplace are navigating a world that wasn't built for us. And it's hard to quite capture how this experience is also exacerbated by a lot of the intersectional conditions that many of my interviewees reflected on, such as neurodivergence, race, educational background, home life, and the list goes on. People feel like they're being punished for the way they exist, or instead they feel that they have to mask their true identity so heavily that they become an imposter of themselves to simply function. Intersectionality is key.
Everyone was white. Like, I didn't come across anybody, man or woman, that wasn't white completely. And so being mixed heritage or anything, there was none of that. There were a lot of people who were acting in a certain way. So even they probably felt like they were being imposters, even though we thought they fitted in or looked like a standard librarian or whatever. They were actually just sort of acting in a way that they thought librarians had to act, or, you know, there was a kind of model, and people weren't really confident about coming out of that. You didn't get very many people certainly nobody brought their whole self to work. That just wasn't a thing. It was very much like, no, don't bring yourself to work. And that ran through a lot of the profession, I suppose. But I've also seen so many amazing women who themselves feel so much so that they're imposters, or that they never ever go for promotions. They never ever even put themselves forward. And I think that happens still today in libraries.
There was something else in that article. There was a great quote where it said something about, it was talking about black women's presence in the workplace and how that's they're at an intersection of race and gender, which leaves them in a precarious position. But their presence there is the result of decades of grassroots activism and begrudgingly developed legislation. And the solution to those things is collective action. Mm-hmm. So solidarity, working together, unionising, and doing more work as a collective body to improve rights for everyone. And so that's where, like, my feminism comes in. My feminism is intersectional or bust. If it's not intersectional, I'm not interested. So this is just a really good example of how I think we could be doing more as feminists in the workplace to lift each other up, put each other forward, to help improve. Because it will improve my situation, but it'll improve all of our situations. And that's what I'm really interested in.
I mean, it's ridiculous that we still talk about that, you know, non-traditional backgrounds. You know, the expectation is people will, you know, go to school, they'll finish school, they will go straight into university, they'll know what they want to study, they'll graduate and then go into work. And I think while we still consider that a traditional progression into work, the world of work has changed so much, and there's no guarantees that if you follow that traditional route, there'll be a job at the end of it, particularly in some of the professions that women traditionally work in, like education and library professions, that those and all those public sector jobs are under threat, so there's no guarantee there's going to be a job at the end of it. But we still do talk about those traditional routes into work. And they exclude so many people, they exclude people whose home backgrounds may be a bit chaotic, like people who are young carers, have a member of their family who's disabled and they help with their care, and that can be unpredictable. It can affect their sleep and it can affect their schoolwork. So they may not achieve the grades that they would otherwise have been expected to achieve. And there's young people in care, who are moving from one place into another and they don't have that stability. They're moving schools. There are people who have dyslexia or other neurodiversity, but it's just not being identified when they're at school. And so they're not, school isn't built for them, particularly neurodivergent people. School isn't built for them. And so they may get to the end of their school years having never learned to navigate a space that wasn't built for them.
How much are we then losing by not having the benefit of their insights and their understanding and their knowledge? They see the world uniquely and differently, and there should be a way to celebrate this. It almost feels like history repeating itself, wherein people are made to feel a certain way and therefore they don't feel valid or they don't feel important. And I think that's a really huge loss, because you think of what these minds could achieve if they were given the right support. It creates an atmosphere where imposter syndrome is invited to thrive because people don't see themselves or their experiences reflected. Then they assume that there's a reason for that, as if they're doing something wrong, so they can blend in and are forced to change, which is really heartbreaking. Again, it's about loss. What are we losing when this is happening?
Obviously, I've always felt a sense of imposter syndrome, but also felt that my imposter syndrome, and this is maybe where I'm slightly different from the people that sort of said, I always felt it was actually a bit of a superpower, because when you're an imposter, it's actually a really brilliant stance to have, because you can then notice things that other people don't notice. You can make changes because you can bring something different. So I totally feel like an imposter when I came into this role in the library, hugely. But actually, it's allowed me to do different things and carve out, bring different audiences, bring different people, make different connections in a way that if I was just a standard mould of a national librarian, you wouldn't be able to. So I think we need more imposters, and we need more people in the profession to kind of own that.
Belle da Costa Green. One moment from the interviews that really stuck with me was a story that Amina was keen to share with me, and it's the note I'd like to end on. She recounted that she was just back from New York, representing the National Library of Scotland at Tartan Week. Whilst there, Amina had the opportunity to visit the Morgan Library, which, despite having a man's name attached to it, could not have been the institution it is today without the librarian, Belle da Costa Green.
The Morgan Library, the JP Morgan Library in New York, which was an amazing collection. They've got a fantastic exhibition. Please look this up, right? Yeah. Look up this story. I was crying when I was going around this exhibition, but I heard about it last year and then I saw the exhibition this year. So Belle da Costa Green was the librarian who built that collection at the Morgan Library. Morgan was the person with the money, but he was a money man, and she was the librarian, and she was absolutely amazing, and she managed to get loads of them. She was an expert in rare books, and she got them everything. She bought up everything, but it's got things like Burns and, all the classics. She was actually black, but she passed as white, so she pretended to be Portuguese. The only person who knew about her real heritage, that it was in her profession, was her lover, who was an art historian, I think, at Yale or something. And she had asked him to burn all her letters because she didn't want anyone to ever know. But actually he didn't. which is questionable whether that's a good thing or not. But as it turned out, now we know the story about Belle having to pretend not to be who she was, literally having to be an imposter, because quite frankly, it wasn't even just a hidden thing, it was an open thing. It didn't want you there. And if you think about that, that's like only 100 years ago or so. So it's, less than that even. So we have a long history of it being very clear who is welcome and where they're welcome, what parts of the library they're welcome in. And I think there's a big thing to do with class around that as well. So if you look in the library profession, a lot of people in a lot of places I've worked, a lot of working class people know everything about the library and might work there for 50 years or whatever, but they never go for promoted posts or they never get those posts. So even accent, I think, has an impact on who people see. I think the difficulty with the library profession is in order to decide to be a librarian, you have to decide it quite in advance of the job appearing. So you have to make a kind of concerted commitment, or I'm going to do a library qualification, I'm going to do this, or, so in a way it makes it difficult for just brilliant people who come in that are something completely different, might decide, I want to work in libraries. It can be there's a financial barrier, there's a time barrier, there's a qualification bar that might stop them ever moving up. And therefore, the people that do tend to always, quite often there's a very sort of homogenous group, or that has been in the past. It's changing now a little bit, but we need to keep on that change. And so you're hearing the story of Belle is so incredibly moving, but it just brings it home to you that was truly always a thing, that it was, and particularly Black librarians, they were absolutely discriminated against, and barriers were put up, and there's a whole group of people, not just her, because her story is quite unique, but there's also a whole group of people that were Black librarians offering services on purpose, having to develop their own services because of segregation, and all that sort of thing, and all the amazing stuff that one of the inspiration events that Kirsten organised, heard about the Harlem Renaissance librarians and all of this, fabulous stuff. So yeah, I think that it is imposter syndrome is alive and well still, but actually, if we can think about imposter syndrome itself differently and use it as a kind of way to think that's exactly what we need, because if you're an imposter, you're not, your voice hasn't been heard, or people with your perspective haven't been included so far. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you can bring something really amazing.
Thank you to my interviewees, Amina Shah, Chaley Brown, Jill Ryan, Jennifer Finlay and Sarah Louise MacDonald, who gave their time and reflections to inspire this chapter. It wouldn't exist without you.